Governor Lincoln Chafee, thank you for being here with us today. We appreciate it. As you know, it's popular these days to criticize Washington as a whole for insufficient bipartisanship. And I wanted to get your take on that critique because you have a unique perspective, having been in a relatively short period of time a Republican, then becoming an independent, and then becoming a Democrat. Given your vantage point, I'm wondering, do you think that bipartisanship in Congress, in Washington, and nationally is a realistic goal right now?
Well, you have to hope for that. We've been through this long stretch. Even when I was there in the Senate, everyone was condemning the poisonous atmosphere, and it's just gotten more and more toxic. And I think what is needed is one side to win a big election. You go back to 1964 when Lyndon Johnson just swept the country, and the Senate and the House was very Democratic, and then through those subsequent years you can get a lot done when one party's in undeniable power of both. Every election, it's not switching back and forth, the House going Democrat, then going Republican, the Senate now up. That's what pulls people to the sides when the chambers are up for the majorities, and who's going to be committee chairs and all that.
Is that the only way to make bipartisanship the norm, though? I mean, there's this mythology, it seems, that's been developing in recent years of, Tip O'Neill working with Ronald Reagan in an era when government was rather divided, but as at least Latter-day interpreters tell it, the two parties were able to work together. So is the only solution one party controlling everything, or is there some way with split control for more comity to occur?
Well, good question. Going back to Reagan and O'Neill, President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill, but even going back to President Clinton and Newt Gingrich, sometimes they could get together, but that was pretty rancorous. And then coming in with Bush and Cheney, and now with President Obama, it just doesn't seem to stop. So I think whether it's changing the gerrymandering of some of these congressional districts where everyone's got safe districts and only a few are up for legitimate change of affiliation of whether Democrat or Republican, or a big landslide election. Probably both of those. Change the gerrymandering and hopefully one side being a Democrat, or be a Democrat, make the case the Affordable Care Act is in your best interest, the middle class. We want to have programs and tax structure that grows the middle class. That's a Democratic tradition, even going back, as I mentioned, Lyndon Johnson. And that's who we have to appeal to.
Do you think, as a Democrat who used to be a Republican, is one party more responsible for the acrimony that exists today? I mean, is it the Republicans' fault for shifting hard to the right, or do the Democrats bear equal blame? What do you think?
Well, my history goes back to the 80s when I was a Republican. I remember how the liberal media so badly mistreated H.W. Bush, President H.W. Bush. Remember they called him a wimp and all these things. I think they, in a way, the liberal wing of the party and the liberal media kind of created the backlash, the Fox News and everything. And now I do blame the Republicans. But it originally started with a kind of mistreatment of a good man, President H.W. Bush, back in the 80s. I just didn't think it was fair. The scanner, he had some trouble with the scanner at the supermarket, and all the abuse he took over that, kind of just trivial things, and the beating he took. And then there was this backlash into this right-wing Fox, if you will, and now it's an industry. And I do blame that for the partisanship now.
You've been on the receiving end of some of that. I mean, you were excoriated in your latter years in the Republican Party as a rhino Republican in name only. I think you were called at one point America's #1 rhino. On a personal level, what's it like to be the target of attacks like that?
Even Ann Coulter had an article, "They shot the wrong Lincoln." I mean, that's how bad it gets. Yeah, she had an article. They shot the wrong Lincoln, because my name's Lincoln Chafee.
How did you learn about that article? I mean,
It came out and people showed it, and there she wrote about how Lincoln Chafee's wrong on all the issues. But I think I stand vindicated on the tax cuts that favor the wealthy. Look at the income disparity. I mean, look at my vote on the Iraq War. I feel very vindicated. Look at Sam Alito and what he's doing in the Supreme Court. I feel vindicated in these votes.
Just to push a little more on the question of what it's like to experience this, Do you remember where you were when you learned that Ann Coulter had written a piece headlined, "They Shot the Wrong Lincoln"? And do you remember how it felt?
I was in the Senate, I remember that, but I don't remember exactly where I was.
Yeah.
Just someone showed me the article.
Did you get angry? I mean, did you want to give her a call and say, hey, this is just beyond the pale?
I'm just focusing on my job, but that type of rhetoric is unforgivable. I mean, and it's happening in my tenure as a governor. We have an editorial writer that it's always ad hominem, just constant personal attacks. It's just not good for our country, not good for our government. Good people that step up to run for office and win, give them a chance to govern.
To what extent did that type of politics lead to you choosing not to seek re-election?
I did play a part in it. I was driving to Maine with my wife, and a 6-hour drive, 7-hour drive, and we were just talking about it. And, your family gets pulled into politics. That's natural. That's just the way it happens. And just talking about that, and time to take a break. I've been doing this since the 80s as a councilman, as a mayor, as a United States senator. Time to take a break. It was a good decision.
I want to ask you about President Obama. You served with him on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and my understanding is that you two became rather close. He was, actually, let me back up. You endorsed him in 2008.
Correct.
And then he returned the favor in 2010 by not endorsing your Democratic opponent, Frank Caprio. What is your assessment at this point in time of Barack Obama's presidency?
Yes, you mentioned us serving together in the Senate. We overlapped for 2 years, and he came in, this rock star. And even I remember making the comment, it's overhype. Barack Obama coming into the Senate, he gave the great speech at the Democratic Convention here in Boston. And he just said, let me do my job. And then, of course, got elected president. I did support him in 2008. And he's turned the ship around, as he said, as he often says, to quote Ronald Reagan, are you better off now than you were before? And that's an easy answer. Yes, we've got the country going in the right direction. I have some disagreements. I'm more of work with our neighbors in the Middle East and some of the drone strikes and things. I like to say, let's act with our brain, not our bicep. Sometimes this muscular approach to these very, very difficult issues, I just don't think we're doing the right thing. I'd rather see us really thinking these through and looking at the consequences for decades to come.
Domestically, are there any areas where you've been frustrated about moves he's made or concerned with approaches he's taken?
No, the Affordable Care Act, of course, is a signature piece of legislation. Obamacare even has his name, and we're in Rhode Island leading the country and getting people to sign up for it. And it's overdue, just seeing how health care just needed a change, and we can always improve the Affordable Care Act if we need to, but it's going in the right direction. So domestically, and the battles he's had with Congress, he's done a great job.
You talked about being a little dismayed at the excessive muscularity of President Obama's approach to the Middle East. Among other things, you're well known for being the only Republican who voted against the use of force in Iraq in 2002. What's it been like to see this man who outlined a different vision of American foreign policy when you served with him on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, maybe act a little more like George W. Bush than you might have expected when you endorsed him back in 2008?
Yes, you put your finger on it. As some would say, on our foreign policy, we're turning into Bush light, and I just disagree with that. We inherited from the 90s a very, very peaceful world. We were getting along with the Russians. Things look good. And September 11th occurred, and that was a moment where we had to make some good decisions. And unfortunately, in my view, we did not. And we abandoned policies that have worked for decades, containment of our adversaries, and working with our allies, went unilaterally and broke Iraq into pieces, and now we're dealing with the consequences. So I think we need a reflection back on that whole containment. And I know some people are talking about it, but it worked. Whether it was the Chinese or the Russians, and eventually the Gorbachevs will come up. Eventually the Deng Xiaopings will come up and democracy will, on its own, take root.
Given that optimistic vision, what's the right way to deal with a situation like what we're looking at in Syria and Iraq right now, where in the wake of this questionable decision we made to invade Iraq in 2002, we now have the Islamic State, which does a lot of very horrible things to the people who live in the region, controlling an ever-widening swath of the region. It seems maybe slightly optimistic to think that there's going to be a Gorbachev or a Deng Xiaoping arising in the near future in the Islamic State. So how do we respond? Are airstrikes the wrong way to go? And if they are, what's the right way?
Well, it took a long time in our experience with the Soviet Union and with China. I mean, the containment policy was really written or articulated by George Kennan in the late 40s. And then implemented in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. I mean, it took decades, but then we saw the fruition of that policy. So whether it's in some of these very, very radical groups, if you contain them and wait for the good leaders to come up, that as happened in China, as happened in the Soviet Union.
So let's say, and I will ask you about Rhode Island issues. I know I'm asking you to relive your years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee here, but let's say you were still on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What would you be advocating we do vis-a-vis ISIS right now?
Well, I like to, who was it, the Chinese philosopher that said, know your enemy? Do we know them? And who are they? And that's the first order of business. Understand what they're all about. And so I think the saying is, know your enemy and you'll win a thousand engagements.
Pretty good sense of that right now, don't we? I mean, we know they want a caliphate, that they say they've established a caliphate. And we know that they're extremely violent in a lethal way to people who don't agree with that vision. So how much more do we need to know?
Well, we didn't know they existed 6 months ago? Is that right? Or 9 months ago?
We either didn't know they existed or we dismissed them as insignificant.
Yes, and so it seems as though there's, I don't want to be casual, but there's a boogeyman of the month almost. It was Iran, and they're going to have a nuclear bomb, and we've got to intervene in Iran. And then it was Syria, and the chemical weapons. We're going after the Syrians, and now it's ISIS, and the boogeyman. I think just we need to think and act with our brain, not our bicep. We have strong alliances around the world. We have to build them back up because we lost a lot of credibility with the invasion of Iraq and with the American people, frankly, saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Over and over it was said. It was a slam dunk, and he didn't. And so we lost a lot of credibility. So there's a lot of building blocks that have to go back into dealing with some of these confrontations.
Let's talk about the state that you are currently governing. As you prepare to leave office, what are the achievements in Rhode Island or the progress that's been made in Rhode Island during your governorship that you're most proud of?
Well, first, the unemployment rate, we're down to 7.7%, so come a long way. And so that's number one.
Remind me, where was it when you took office?
I believe it was 11.8. And so we're getting people back to work, number one. And secondly, our cities and towns. When I took office, 5 Rhode Island cities and towns were eligible for state intervention. And we have a legislation that cites that eligibility for state intervention. So Providence was eligible, Pawtucket was eligible, Woonsocket was eligible for state intervention, West Warwick was eligible for state. We did intervene in East Providence, and of course Central Falls did go bankrupt. So now, 4 years later, coming on to 4 years later, they're all back on their feet because we put the money back in. The previous governor did a lot of cuts to the cities and towns, and I'm very proud. We had to do some revenue, tax increases to accomplish this, but we're getting them back on solid footing. Providence, Pawtucket, Woonsocket, West Warwick, Central Falls. Very, very proud of that, especially being a former mayor.
You have talked about how excited you are about the future of wind power in Rhode Island. I'm wondering if you are concerned at all by the cautionary tale that is 38 Studios, because that seemed like a case study in what happens when the state, or any state, overinvests its hopes in one particular industry. Does that give you pause as you look ahead to a robust future for wind energy in Rhode Island?
Yes, to be clear, I'm also a big proponent of Canadian hydropower. And the former premier of Quebec Premier Charest, stood in the Burlington meeting of Eastern Canadian premiers and New England governors and said, we have the chance to be the low-cost green energy capital of North America if we work together. Those words are ringing in my ears. We have this Canadian hydro coming down from Quebec and from Labrador, and the market that's here in the Northeast, clean hydropower with our wind energy, with some natural gas, not as clean as the other two, and some solar. That's our goal, because right now we're the high-cost energy capital of North America. So it's only common sense. We're working on that too. So not only wind, which we're doing, of course, in deep water wind in Rhode Island and Cape Wind in Massachusetts, but get some of this hydropower down from Quebec. They're building more and more these facilities in Labrador also. It could be a great winner for our economy here in this region.
You talked about
And
trouble.
I've been up there to see the dams in Labrador and in Quebec. They're very, very impressive. The water flows downhill. The sun shines, water evaporates, it rains, the water flows downhill, very clean. I know there's few environmental issues, I'm aware of that, some of the flooding when you build the dams. But in all, up there in that empty part of our world up there in Quebec, northern Quebec and Labrador, if you're going to flood, that's the place to do it.
It's a nice system. I mean, you talk about it floods, the water runs downhill.
Yes, and they have several dams, I think 9 dams on one of the rivers, so they say we get the same molecule of water generating electricity over and over again as it goes through the successive dams.
You talked a few minutes ago about troubled cities that have turned around under your governorship. As you may have heard, former Providence Mayor Buddy Cianci is seeking to win election as mayor once again. And I'm wondering what you think Providence's future will hold if Mr. Cianci takes that office again.
Well, everybody knows he's the good buddy and the bad buddy. That's been his history. And the bad buddy's very bad, and the good buddy's full of energy and ideas. And I just don't think Providence is going to go back to that yin and yang of the good and the bad buddy. I just think after David Cicilline coming in and doing a good job as mayor of Providence, and then Angel Tavares doing a good job getting back to an ethical climate, letting companies know that when they come here it's going to be a fair table to do business. I just don't think the voters are going to go back to that circus that comes with the good and the bad buddy.
Notwithstanding the polls, because he seems to be doing pretty well.
Yes, but the undecideds are still large. I just think the undecideds are going to break to Jorge Elorza, which is really anybody but Buddy. I mean, that's what it's all about.
For those of us who have only watched Buddy Cianci from afar, what's the source of his enduring appeal, at least in some quarters?
Well, he's very smart, and the good buddy is full of good ideas, and he'll tell you all about them, and that's what he's good at. There's no one like him as far as quick on his feet. He's one of a kind. But unfortunately, the bad buddy, he couldn't get into a restaurant, the story goes, in Providence, and so he had the police or the fire department come and shut it down. And then the poor owner of the restaurant had to come in and sit in his office waiting for an appointment for 5 hours to get his license back. And just because he couldn't get a seat, the restaurant was full. And he took a kind of an immature, juvenile reaction. That's kind of that's the bad aspect that just does not help our economy in Providence.
I hadn't heard that story before.
Yeah, the restaurant was Amsterdam's, kind of a famous story, I guess. Yeah. Of the poor guy had to come in, and he had an appointment for the morning, but finally got in to see the mayor. The mayor swore at him and said, "Don't you ever dare." You know, that's the bad buddy. And he went back, finally closed his restaurant, went back to New York. And I'm sure when people said, "What's it like to open a business in Providence?" he would say, "Don't do it." And that's not what we want.
Last question for you. What are your plans after you leave the governorship? What are you going to do?
Well, take a break. That's the first thing. And I'm not sure yet after that. Finish strongly. I still have some issues in Rhode Island that I want to conclude in a good fashion to hand off the state in the best possible shape I can.
What are those issues? What's on your final to-do list?
The Department of Youth, Children, and Families. We're having some cost overruns there, so we have a task force in there, and it's just constant trying to manage these high costs of this very, very difficult population, DCYF. believe it or not, we have a little fire district in Coventry. I was at the negotiations of the Central Coventry Fire District with the union, trying to resolve that for about 3 hours yesterday. The Department of Motor Vehicles is always a challenge. We're getting down from when I took office, 5-hour waits were the norm. We're down to about 40 minutes. So that keep on top of that. We're trying to hire some temporary workers at the 10 to 2 lunchtime hours. The union finally is agreeing to allow us to hire these temps. So these are some of the areas. Rhode Island Housing has some issues. So about 4 areas I'm really focused on. I want to resolve very beneficially. DCYF, DMV, Rhode Island Housing, Central Coventry Fire District.
Do you think you'll stay politically involved when you leave office, or will you maybe take a few years off?
I'll probably stay involved in some way. I've been doing it a long time, so we'll see.
And might you, my recollection, which I went and double checked, is that you had this unusual career early in life. You were a farrier, right? Shoeing
Yes.
horses. Will you shoe horses again?
Well, my horse died right before I became governor, and I
Oh, I'm
always
sorry.
shoed my horse. And I did not replace him after I got this busy job. I was able to keep my horse all through the Senate and mayor years and ride him and shoe him. So that kept me in the business, but I'm sure I could pick it right up. I did it for 7 years on the racetrack. Is that my next career? Who knows? Go back to my roots.
Do you think you'll ride again? You mentioned that your horse died when you became governor. You don't have another horse right now?
No, I don't. That was my therapy, to go down and saddle up. Trapper was his name, and go out for a trail ride. So we'll see. I just, again, I want to finish this 10 years governor in the strongest shape possible, hand off a good state to the next administration, then make some decisions on politics, on horses. But I'm very lucky. My family's doing well. Children are excelling at what they do, and so things are good.
All right, Governor Chafee, thank you for taking the
you.
time to talk with us.
It's a pleasure.